Hey guys, tonight we're travelling back nearly 500 years to a small, damp, smoky corner of England, to a world of kings who changed their minds about God the way other people change their socks, of streets that doubled as toilets, and of a population so convinced you could die at any moment that they were, frankly, usually right. Tonight we are going to Tudor Britain, and I am going to spend the next little while gently explaining all the ways it would have killed you. But before we set off across the centuries, if this channel helps you switch off your busy brain and drift away, hit the like button and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. Because there's something lovely about picturing all of us, scattered across the modern world, lying awake together, refusing to go to sleep at a sensible hour. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some cool white background noise. Get comfortable, because we have a long night ahead, and the very good news, the best news really, is that you do not actually have to survive any of it. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in the time of Henry VIII, the king with the 6 wives and the increasingly alarming temper? Have you ever wondered what people ate and drank and wore, and how on earth they avoided dying of something so trivial that today you'd treat it with a pill from the corner shop? Have you ever wondered why they almost never washed? Why they were terrified of the dark? Why a bad cough could empty an entire street? Or why saying the wrong sentence about the wrong subject could get you very publicly and very permanently dead? Well, tonight you're going to find out, because you are going to live a single day in Tudor Britain. Just one. 24 hours. And I'm sorry to tell you, you are almost certainly not going to make it. Congratulations. You've just woken up in England, sometime around the year 1540. Henry VIII is on the throne, growing wider and angrier by the year. You are not a king. You are not a noble. You are an ordinary person, a commoner, one of the vast majority who did the work, paid the taxes, caught the diseases, and kept their opinions very carefully to themselves. You live in a small house in a small town, and you own almost nothing, and the next 24 hours are going to throw roughly 40 different ways to die at you, most of which you won't even see coming. So let's begin. It's the small black hours before dawn. The fire has gone out. Something is biting your ankle, and somewhere outside a dog is screaming. Welcome to your one and only Tudor day. Let's see how long you last. You wake because you are cold. That is the first thing Tudor Britain teaches you, before you have even opened your eyes. You are cold, in a way that modern people, with their radiators and their duvets and their thermostats they argue about, simply cannot imagine. It is the hour before dawn, which in a world without electric light is a genuinely serious hour, a thick, total velvet darkness that swallows the room whole. There is no soft glow of a phone charging. There is no streetlight bleeding through the curtains. There is just black and cold, and the slow awareness that you are awake and the night is not finished with you yet. The fire has gone out. Of course it has. Keeping a fire alive through the night was a real skill and a real chore. And the embers in the hearth have died down to nothing, which means the one source of warmth and light in your entire home is now a heap of grey ash. Relighting it is not a matter of flicking a switch. It involves a tinderbox, a scrap of charred cloth, a flint, a piece of steel, and a great deal of patient swearing in the dark. People kept fires going precisely because starting them again was so miserable. So you lie there. You can hear the others breathing, because you are almost certainly not alone. You can hear the wind finding every gap in the walls. And there are many gaps, because your house is built of timber and wattle and daub, which is to say sticks and mud and hope. You can hear, somewhere out in the dark, the sounds of a town that never fully sleeps and never fully feels safe. A dog, a shout, the watchman, the endless creak of a world made of wood. And you can feel the cold seeping up from the floor, and the damp in the air, and the small specific itch of something living in the bedding with you, which we will get to, because we are going to get to that. Here is your first lesson in not lasting 24 hours. The cold itself can kill you. Not tonight, perhaps, not all at once, but the Tudor winter was a slow predator, and the very old and the very young and the very poor simply did not always wake up. There was no central heating, there was no insulation, there was a fire when you could afford the fuel and keep it lit, and there was everyone huddling together, and there was wool, and there was prayer, and that was the entire Tudor defence against the cold. You pull the rough blanket tighter. You are not getting up yet. Nobody sane gets up before they have to in a house this cold. You lie in the dark, listening to the breathing and the wind, and you wait for the one thing that will make this bearable, which is the sky, very slowly, beginning to turn from black to the faintest, palest grey. Morning is coming. In Tudor Britain, that is both a relief and a threat. Let's find out why. Let us talk about the bed, because you are still in it, and because the Tudor bed is a more crowded and more lively place than you might hope. First, you are probably not alone in it. Privacy, in the modern sense, is a luxury that had not really been invented yet for ordinary people. Beds were shared, routinely, cheerfully, out of necessity. You might share with your spouse, your children, your siblings, a visiting relative, or, if you were staying at an inn, a complete and snoring stranger who paid for the other half of the mattress. Nobody thought this was strange. Warmth was warmth, and a bed was expensive, and you did not waste either. Now, the bed itself. If you were poor, you slept on a straw mattress, a sack stuffed with straw or rushes, laid on the floor or on a low wooden frame. It was lumpy, it rustled, and it was a thriving ecosystem. If you were a bit better off, you might have a flock mattress, stuffed with wool scraps, which was softer and somehow even better at hosting wildlife. And if you were genuinely comfortable, you had a proper bed with ropes strung across the frame to support the mattress. Ropes that sagged over time and had to be tightened, which some people will cheerfully tell you is where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from, though historians are politely doubtful. And here is the part you have been dreading, the part your ankle has been warning you about. The bed had company, fleas, lice, bedbugs. The straw and the wool and the warmth of human bodies made a Tudor mattress a 5-star resort for tiny biting things, and there was very little you could do about it. People simply lived with being bitten. They expected it. An itchy night was a normal night. Some bedding was changed and aired when possible. Herbs like lavender and fleabane were scattered about in hope, but the truth is that you shared your bed not just with your family, but with thousands of other, smaller residents who were absolutely delighted to have you. This matters more than it sounds, and here is the second way Tudor Britain is quietly trying to kill you. Fleas are not just itchy. Fleas carried plague. The bubonic plague, which returned to England again and again throughout the Tudor period, emptying towns and killing in numbers that are hard to comprehend, was spread by fleas, the very fleas merrily feasting on you right now in the dark. Nobody knew this, of course. They blamed bad air, sin, the alignment of the planets, foreigners, cats. They did not blame the flea, which is exactly why the flea did so very well. So you lie there in your shared, sagging, softly rustling, thoroughly inhabited bed, scratching, listening to the breathing of 3 or 4 other people, and feeling the first grey light begin to leak into the room. And the bed, for all its faults, is warm. It is the warmest place you will be all day, which is why, knowing what's waiting out there, you really, really do not want to get up. But you must get up, because the day will not work itself, and so you swing your legs out into the cold and begin the surprisingly involved process of getting dressed. And getting dressed in Tudor Britain is not just a practical matter, it is a legal one. First, the practicalities. There are no quick options here. You don't have elastic, or zips, or buttons in any great number. Clothing was fastened with laces, points, pins, and hooks, and putting on a full outfit was a job that took time, and, ideally, a second pair of hands. You start with your linen shirt or smock, the layer worn next to the skin, the one piece of your wardrobe that got washed with any regularity, because linen could be boiled and beaten and dried, and washing your linen was, for most people, what passed for washing yourself. We'll come back to that horror shortly. Over the linen go the wool layers, because almost everything you own is made of wool. Wool is warm, wool is durable, wool is itchy, and wool is everywhere. A working person might have a wool kirtle or doublet, wool hose, a wool cap, and if they were lucky, a wool cloak. You probably own one good outfit and one working outfit, and that is your entire wardrobe, and you will wear it until it falls apart, and then you will patch it and wear it some more. Now, here is where it gets strange, and here is the third quiet danger of the Tudor day. You were not actually allowed to wear whatever you liked. England had what were called sumptuary laws, laws that dictated, in tremendous and slightly mad detail, exactly what fabrics, colours, and furs each level of society was permitted to wear. Purple silk and cloth of gold, royalty and the highest nobility only. Certain furs, certain dyes, velvet of a particular kind, all of it was rationed by rank. The idea was that you should be able to tell a person's exact place in the great hierarchy simply by looking at them, and that dressing above your station was not just tacky, it was a genuine offence against the natural order, punishable by fines. For you, a commoner, this mostly means that the truly fine stuff is forbidden anyway, and you couldn't afford it regardless. But the principle hangs over everything. Clothing in Tudor Britain was a uniform. It announced who you were, where you belonged, and how much you mattered before you had said a single word. To dress above yourself was to lie about your place in the world, and the Tudor world took its places extremely seriously. So you lace yourself into your itchy, woolen, rigidly appropriate outfit, in the cold, in the dark, your fingers fumbling the points and the pins. You pull on your cap, because a respectable person kept their head covered, and you are dressed finally, correctly, legally, for a day you are not going to enjoy. Now, about that washing, let us address the smell, gently, because there is no avoiding it, and because it is one of the great quiet truths of the Tudor world, that everybody, all the time, smelled absolutely dreadful, and almost nobody noticed, because there was nothing to compare it to. You do not bathe. Not really. Not the way you understand bathing. The idea of immersing your whole body in hot water on a regular basis was, to a Tudor person, not just impractical but actively dangerous. The best medical thinking of the day held that water, especially warm water, opened the pores and let disease into the body. Bathing, in this view, was how you caught the plague, not how you avoided it. So washing the whole body was rare, suspicious, and largely reserved for the wealthy who could afford the risk and the effort, and even they didn't do it often. Instead, you washed by changing and laundering your linen. The clean linen shirt against the skin was believed to absorb the body's dirt and sweat, drawing it away, so that putting on fresh linen was, in the Tudor mind, genuinely getting clean. You might wipe your face and hands with a damp cloth. You might rinse your mouth and pick your teeth with a cloth or a twig. But scrub yourself all over with soap and hot water? No. That way, everyone agreed, lay illness and death. The result is a world that, to a modern nose, would be physically overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, in unwashed wool, that has been worn for weeks, sweat. The privy, never far away. Animals living close to or inside the home. Smoke from the fire soaked into everything. Rotting rushes on the floor. The streets outside, which we will get to, and which are worse. The whole of Tudor Britain existed in a thick, permanent fugue of human and animal odour that simply was the smell of being alive. But here is the thing, and it is genuinely worth holding on to in the dark. They did not smell it. Not really. When everyone smells the same, and you have smelled it your entire life, it becomes invisible, the background hum of existence. They masked the worst of it with herbs and flowers. They carried little bundles of sweet-smelling plants called nosegays to hold to the face when passing something especially ripe. The wealthy wore pomanders stuffed with spices. But the deep, all-encompassing reek of the age, they did not notice at all, any more than you notice the smell of your own home. So you, with your modern nose, would last about 4 seconds before gagging. They lasted a lifetime, contentedly, never knowing anything was wrong. It is, in its way, a mercy. Now you are awake, dressed, unwashed, and bitten. The grey light is strengthening. Your stomach is starting to complain. It is time, at last, for breakfast, and you will be relieved to hear it involves beer. Here is a piece of good news at last. In Tudor Britain, breakfast comes with beer. So does lunch, so does dinner, so frankly, does the entire day. You are about to live in a society that runs, gently and permanently, on a low and steady tide of alcohol, and there is an excellent reason for it, which is that the water was trying to kill you. Let's start with the food, which is humble. Breakfast for an ordinary person was not the groaning feast you might imagine. It was bread, often coarse, dark bread made of rye or barley, or a mix of whatever grain was cheapest, because fine white wheaten bread was for the rich. There might be a lump of hard cheese. There might be the leftovers of yesterday's pottage, the thick vegetable stew that bubbled away in a pot at the heart of every poor household, made of oats, peas, beans, onions, leeks, and whatever else came to hand, eaten day after day, topped up rather than finished. Pottage was the true food of Tudor Britain, the reliable, endless, slightly grey heart of the common diet. And to drink you have ale, or beer, not as a treat, as the default, as water's replacement. Because here is the thing, and here is your next gentle brush with death. The water was not safe. In a world where the street was the sewer, and the well was downhill from the cesspit, drinking plain water was a genuine way to make yourself violently ill, and people knew it, even if they didn't know why. So instead, they drank ale, which was brewed by boiling the water first, which killed the things in it, though nobody understood that part. They just knew that ale didn't give you the runs, and the water sometimes did. So everyone drank ale. Men, women, and yes, children. This was small ale, or small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew made for daily drinking, designed to hydrate rather than intoxicate. You would not get roaring drunk on small beer, but you would maintain, throughout the entire day, from breakfast onwards, a gentle, permanent, low-level haze, a sort of soft background fuzz of mild inebriation that was simply the normal state of the Tudor mind. The whole country was, in the most polite and functional possible way, a little bit tipsy all the time, from childhood to death. The wealthy drank wine as well, imported and expensive, a marker of status. But ale was the people's drink, brewed in homes and alehouses across the land, often by women, the alewives, who were among the few independent business people of their sex. A good alewife was a valued member of the community. A bad one, who watered her ale or used short measures, could find herself in real trouble, as we'll see when we get to the more theatrical end of Tudor justice. So you eat your dark bread and your reheated pottage, and you drink your morning ale, and the soft warm fuzz settles over you, and for a moment, full and faintly buzzed by the fire, life in Tudor Britain feels almost bearable. Then you have to go outside, and outside is where it really begins. You open your door, step out into the morning, and are immediately assaulted by the single most defining feature of the Tudor town, the street, which is, to put it as delicately as I can, also the toilet, and the bin, and the slaughterhouse runoff, and the general repository for everything nobody wanted in their house. There were no sewers as we understand them. Waste of every kind went into the street, into open channels called kennels that ran down the middle or sides of the road, carrying a slow, foul, unspeakable soup down towards the nearest river, which was also where you got your water, which is a circular arrangement that the Tudor mind somehow managed not to dwell on. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows, ideally with a warning shout, often without. Butchers threw out the bits of animal nobody would buy. Households tossed their rubbish, their ash, their rotting scraps. Pigs, wandering semi-wild, ate some of it and produced more of their own. The ground beneath your feet, then, is not ground. It is a churned, stinking paste of mud, sewage, animal dung, rotting food, and worse, deepening in the rain into something that could genuinely swallow a shoe or a small child. Towns passed ordinance after ordinance trying to control it, ordering people not to dump waste in the street, not to let pigs roam, to clean the area outside their own door. These laws were ignored with magnificent consistency, because where else, exactly, was the waste supposed to go? This is your next brush with death, and it's a big one. The filth was not just unpleasant, it was lethal. The contamination of water supplies by human and animal waste meant that diseases of the gut, dysentery, typhoid, and the rest were a constant presence, flaring into deadly outbreaks with grim regularity. The flies that bred in the muck spread it further. The rats that thrived in it, we have already discussed, carried the fleas that carried the plague. The Tudor street was, in effect, a vast open-air culture dish for everything that wanted to kill you, and you walked through it every single day, in thin leather shoes, trying not to breathe too deeply. You learned to walk close to the buildings, under the overhanging upper floors, partly for shelter, and partly to avoid whatever might come down from a window above. You learn to watch your footing. You learn, above all, not to think too hard about what you are walking through, because to think about it clearly would be to never leave the house again. And the smell, which we discussed earlier, the smell you supposedly don't notice, reaches here its absolute glorious peak. This is the source. This is the engine room of the great Tudor stench. You pick your way down the filthy street towards your work, holding a sprig of herbs to your nose, stepping over the kennel, dodging a pig. The town is waking up around you, loud and close and reeking, and somewhere in this churning mess of humanity, you have a living to earn. Now you go to work, and Tudor work is not the gentle, padded, ergonomically chaired affair you might be used to. It is long, it is hard, it is physical, and it occupies very nearly all the daylight there is. The Tudor working day ran, broadly, from dawn to dusk. In summer, that could mean 14 or more hours of labour. In winter, the days were shorter, but the work was no easier, and the cold made it worse. There were no weekends in the modern sense, though Sundays and the many religious holy days provided breaks, of which more shortly. But the basic rhythm of life was simple and relentless. The sun came up, you worked, the sun went down, you stopped, because working in the dark was difficult, and candlelight was too precious to waste on labour. What did you do? It depends who you are, but the odds are overwhelming that you worked the land. The vast majority of Tudor people were involved in agriculture in some form, ploughing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, tending animals, the endless wheel of the farming year that governed everything. It was backbreaking, weather-dependent, and utterly without mercy. A bad harvest didn't mean a disappointing quarter. It meant hunger, real hunger, and possibly starvation, for you and everyone you knew. If you lived in a town, you might be a craftsperson or a labourer, working in one of the many trades, often under the strict supervision of a guild, the organizations that controlled who could practice a craft, how they trained, and what they charged. You might be an apprentice, bound for years to a master, working for your keep and your training. You might be a servant, of which there were a great many, working in someone else's household for board and a small wage. You might haul, dig, carry, build, brew, bake, weave, or sew. Whatever it was done by hand, by muscle, for hours, every day. And here is the danger woven through all of it. Quieter than plague, but just as real. The work itself could kill or cripple you. There was no health and safety. There were no regulations, no protective equipment, no compensation if something went wrong. Falls, crushing injuries, wounds that turned septic, the slow wreckage of joints and backs worn out by decades of labor, the loss of a hand or an eye to a moment's bad luck with a tool. An injury that today means a hospital visit and a few weeks off meant, in Tudor Britain, that you might never work again, and a person who could not work was a person in very serious trouble indeed. So you labour, you bend and lift and carry and dig, in your itchy wool, under the wide indifferent sky, or in the close heat of a workshop. Your hands harden, your back aches, the hours stretch. And you do it not because you might get a promotion, or build a career, or find fulfillment, but because the alternative, idleness and poverty, was treated by Tudor society not as a misfortune, but as a crime. Which brings us neatly to the next way your day could go horribly wrong. Let us pause mid-morning for a quiet word about keeping your mouth shut. Because in Tudor Britain, one of the very easiest ways to die was to say the wrong thing, out loud, to the wrong person, about the wrong subject. And the wrong subjects were numerous, and they kept changing. The great minefield, the one that could blow up under anyone at any moment, was religion. You have woken up around 1540, which places you in the middle of one of the most dangerous and confusing religious upheavals in English history. Henry VIII, unable to get the Pope to grant him a divorce, had broken England away from the Roman Catholic Church and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This was not a small administrative change. It was a seismic rupture that turned faith, the most fundamental thing in most people's lives, into a matter of treason. Think about what this meant for an ordinary person. The religion your grandparents had practiced, the old Catholic faith with its monasteries and its saints and its Latin Mass, was being dismantled around you. The monasteries were being dissolved, their wealth seized, their buildings stripped, the monks and nuns turned out. The rules of what you were supposed to believe and say and do were shifting under your feet, and getting it wrong, publicly, could be fatal. Say too loudly that you missed the old ways, that the king had no business meddling with the church, and you could be accused of treason. Deny the king's supremacy, and you could follow Thomas More and John Fisher to the executioner's block. But lean too far the other way, embrace the new Protestant ideas too eagerly while the king was in a Catholic mood, and you could be burned as a heretic. Henry, magnificently, executed people on both sides, Catholics for treason and Protestants for heresy, sometimes on the same day, just to make his position unambiguously confusing. And it would keep changing after him. His son Edward would push hard towards Protestantism. His daughter Mary would swing violently back to Catholicism and burn Protestants by the hundred. His daughter Elizabeth would settle into a careful middle path that still left plenty of room to get yourself killed. Within a single lifetime, the official faith of England changed 4 times, and each change came with a fresh set of ways to be on the wrong side of it. So the great survival skill of the Tudor commoner was caution. You went to the church you were told to go to. You said the prayers you were told to say. You kept your real opinions, if you had any, locked up tight behind your teeth, and you watched, very carefully, which way the wind was blowing from London. The person who spoke their mind freely about God and the king was not brave. They were very often dead. So this morning, as you work, and the talk turns, as it always does, to the latest news from the capital, you say nothing controversial. You nod. You agree that the king is wise. You keep your head down. You have survived, for now, the most dangerous conversation in England, simply by refusing to have it. Speaking of religion, let us deal with church, because in Tudor Britain, church is not optional. It is not a private matter, and it is very much the government's business whether you attend. You might think of religious observance as a personal choice. The Tudor state did not. Going to church was a legal requirement, an expression of loyalty not just to God but to the crown, and your absence was noticed, recorded, and potentially punished. Under Elizabeth, fixed fines were set for those who failed to attend their parish church on Sundays and holy days, and those who stubbornly stayed away. The recusants, mostly Catholics who could not in conscience attend the Protestant service, faced mounting penalties that could ruin a family. Your faith was not between you and God. It was between you and the magistrate, so you go. Everyone goes. The whole community files into the parish church, and the church is the beating heart of the village or the town, the one building everyone shares, the place where you are baptized, married, and buried, the great clock that measures out every life. The services, the rhythms of the year, the bells that ring across the fields, all of it structures time itself in a way that is hard for the modern mind to grasp. There was no separating the sacred from the everyday. They were the same thing. But remember what we just said about the shifting ground. The church you attend has been changing, physically and spiritually, within living memory. The colourful statues of saints, the wall paintings, the rood screens, the candles, the rich Catholic ornament that had filled these buildings for centuries, much of it was being stripped out, whitewashed over, smashed or sold. The Latin Mass that your parents knew was giving way, in fits and starts, to services in English. The very walls of your church bore the scars of the great religious argument, patches of pale plaster where a saint used to be, and you sat through it. The services were long. You stood, you knelt, you mumbled the responses, you listened to sermons that could stretch on for an hour or more, and you absorbed, week after week, the official version of what you were supposed to believe this year. The literate few might follow along, the rest simply performed the required motions, the great communal choreography of belonging, and hoped they were doing it right. Here is the quiet danger then. Church was both your refuge and your surveillance. It was genuine comfort, community, meaning, the framework that held a hard life together, and most people believed, sincerely and deeply, in a way that shaped everything. But it was also the place where your conformity was checked, where your absence was logged, where the authorities could see, at a glance, who was loyal and who was not. To stay away was to mark yourself. To attend was to be counted. So you kneel on the cold stone in the whitewashed church among your neighbours, and you say the words, and you keep your soul to yourself. It is by now mid-morning. You have not yet died. Well done, but the day is far from over, and you are getting hungry again. Before we eat again, we need to talk about money, and about the genuinely alarming Tudor attitude towards those who didn't have any. Because in Tudor Britain, being poor was not merely a hardship. Increasingly, it was treated as a crime. You are poor. Let us be clear about that. The overwhelming majority of Tudor people lived close to the edge, with little margin between getting by and disaster. A run of bad harvests, an illness, an injury, the death of a breadwinner, a change in the wider economy, any of these could tip a struggling family into genuine destitution with frightening speed. And the Tudor period saw a great deal of this. Prices rose, populations grew, the old systems of charity provided by the monasteries vanished when Henry dissolved them, and the number of desperately poor people wandering the country in search of work or relief swelled alarmingly. And the authorities did not respond to this with sympathy. They responded with fear and with laws of escalating cruelty. The great Tudor anxiety was the sturdy beggar, the able-bodied person who, in the official view, could work but chose to beg or wander instead. Such people were seen not as victims but as a threat to order, and the punishments aimed at them were savage. Under various vagrancy laws across the period, a person caught wandering without work or a master could be whipped, branded, have a hole bored through their ear, be enslaved, or eventually, for persistent offenders, be hanged. For the crime of being poor and homeless in the wrong place. There was a distinction, drawn with great moral confidence, between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. The deserving poor were those who genuinely could not work, the old, the sick, the disabled, the orphaned, and for these, a system of parish relief slowly developed, funded by local taxes, administered by the parish. The undeserving poor were the able-bodied who, it was assumed, were simply idle, and for them there was the whip and the brand and worse. The fact that there often was no work to be had, that the economy itself was throwing people into destitution, was not something the system was much interested in. So here is your danger, and it is a structural one, hanging over your whole existence. You must stay employed, settled, and visibly useful. To lose your work and your place, to find yourself on the road looking for the next job, was to risk being treated as a criminal vagrant. Your settlement, your belonging to a particular parish that was responsible for you, was a kind of safety, and losing it was perilous. Poverty itself could get you whipped through the streets. You pay your way, then, carefully. You hold on to your work. You stay where you are known. You give what little you can to the parish poor box, knowing that the line between you and the wretch being whipped at the cart's tail is thinner than anyone likes to admit. In Tudor Britain, you are always one disaster away from becoming the very thing the law exists to punish. It is a sobering thought to carry to market. So let's go to market. It is time to buy and sell. And so you make your way to the market, the loud, crowded, chaotic commercial heart of the town, where everything happens and everyone is, to some degree, trying to cheat everyone else. The market was the great gathering. On market days, the town swelled with people from the surrounding countryside, farmers bringing produce, traders setting up stalls, animals being driven in to be sold, a heaving press of buyers and sellers and pickpockets and gossips and officials. It was where you bought what you couldn't make and sold what you could spare, where news travelled, where you saw and were seen. It was also, frankly, the social media of its day, the place where reputations were made and destroyed, and where everyone learned everyone else's business, and it was riddled with attempts at fraud, which is why it was so heavily regulated. The authorities were obsessed, reasonably enough, with the honesty of trade, because in a world where most people lived close to the edge, being cheated on the price or weight of your bread or your ale was not a minor annoyance. It was a real threat to survival. So there were rules about everything. There was the assize of bread and ale, an ancient and elaborate system that fixed the price, weight, and quality of these staples according to the cost of grain, so that a baker could not simply charge what he liked or sell a loaf that was mostly air. Officials called things like ale conners and clerks of the market went about checking weights, testing quality, inspecting goods, and woe betide the trader caught cheating. And here we arrive at one of the more entertaining and revealing features of Tudor justice, which is that punishment was theatre. A baker who sold underweight loaves might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending bread tied around his neck, publicly shamed before the whole community. A trader who sold rotten food might be locked in the pillory while the very goods he tried to sell were burned under his nose. The punishment was designed to be seen, to humiliate, to make an example, to entertain even as it warned. The famous cucking stool, or ducking stool, was used for a range of offences, including, notoriously, against scolds, but also against dishonest tradespeople, particularly brewers and bakers, who might be strapped into the chair and dunked in the river or pond to the delight of the watching crowd. Justice was a spectacle, a public performance with the community as both audience and jury, and shame was its primary weapon, because in a small, tight-knit world where everyone knew everyone, shame was genuinely powerful. So you move through the market, haggling, watching the scales, keeping a hand on your purse against the cut-purses who worked the crowds, and casting the occasional glance at the pillory in the square, where some poor wretch is spending the day locked up and pelted with rotten vegetables for some offence against honest trade. You buy your bread, carefully checked. You sell your few goods, and you give thanks quietly that today the figure in the pillory is not you. You're hungry again. Let's see what's for the midday meal. Now comes dinner, which in Tudor Britain is not the evening meal but the midday one, the largest and most important meal of the day, eaten around late morning to midday, when the light was good and the body needed fueling for the afternoon's labour. And what you eat for dinner depends enormously on who you are. For you, an ordinary person, dinner is hearty but plain, built on the great foundations of the common diet, bread and pottage. The bread is dark and coarse, as we've discussed. The pottage is thick and filling, that endless stew of grains and pulses and vegetables. There might be cheese, there might be a bit of bacon or salted fish, there might be more of the small ale. Vegetables that grew well in the English climate. Onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, peas, root vegetables formed the backbone of what you ate. Fruit was eaten in season but viewed with some suspicion, often cooked rather than raw, because raw fruit was blamed for fluxes and fevers. Meat was the great divider. For the poor, meat was occasional, a treat, a Sunday luxury or a festival indulgence. Often the cheaper cuts and the bits the wealthy didn't want, stretched as far as it would go in a stew. But for the rich, oh, for the rich, dinner was a different universe entirely. The Tudor wealthy ate meat in spectacular, almost competitive quantities, great roasts of beef and mutton and pork, venison from their parks, and an astonishing variety of birds, not just chickens and geese and ducks, but swans, herons, peacocks, larks, and other creatures that would horrify a modern diner. A great household's feast was a display of power and wealth, as much as a meal, course after course, the table groaning. And here, woven into the food, is a quieter danger, the slow danger of the Tudor diet itself. The poor diet, heavy on bread and pottage, and short on fresh fruit and vegetables for much of the year, could leave people vulnerable to deficiency diseases. The rich diet, drowning in meat and increasingly in sugar, with very little in the way of fresh greenery, created its own problems, gout, rotting teeth, and worse. Neither end of the social scale ate what we would call a balanced diet, because the very concept did not exist, and food was understood through the old system of humours, hot and cold, wet and dry, balancing the body's qualities rather than its nutrients. But for now, you don't care about any of that. You are a working body that has been awake and labouring since before dawn, and you fall on your bread and your pottage and your ale with genuine gratitude. It is plain, it is repetitive, it is the same thing you ate yesterday and will eat tomorrow, but it is food, and your belly is full, and the afternoon sun, such as it is warm enough on your back. You have survived until dinner. Most of you do. But the afternoon holds the part of the Tudor day that killed more people than punishment, poverty, and the street combined. Because now we have to talk about disease. Let us talk, gently, about disease. Because disease is the great unspoken passenger of every Tudor day, the thing that hung over every life, that emptied streets and broke families and could turn a healthy morning into a deathbed by nightfall. If anything was going to end your 24 hours, statistically, it was this. The Tudor world did not understand what caused disease. They had no notion of germs, of bacteria, of viruses. The leading theory, inherited from the ancients, was miasma, the idea that illness was caused by bad air, foul-smelling vapors rising from rotting matter, swamps and filth. This was, in a roundabout way, not entirely useless, since it encouraged people to avoid the most disgustingly contaminated places, but it fundamentally misunderstood what was happening, and so the actual mechanisms of contagion went merrily unaddressed. And the diseases came. The plague, the Great Terror, returned again and again, sweeping through towns and cities, killing with horrifying speed and in horrifying numbers, closing theatres, emptying London, sending those who could afford it fleeing to the countryside, and leaving the poor to die in the infected streets. When plague came, a household might be sealed up, sometimes with the healthy locked in alongside the dying, a red cross daubed on the door, a brutal quarantine that often amounted to a death sentence for everyone inside. Then there was the sweating sickness, a peculiarly Tudor horror, a mysterious illness that arrived suddenly, killed with terrifying speed, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms, and then vanished as mysteriously as it came. It struck several times across the period, and it had a particular and unsettling habit of killing the young and the strong and the well-fed as readily as the weak. People said you could be merry at dinner and dead by supper, and they were not exaggerating. And beyond the great killers, the everyday ones, the endless background hum of mortal danger, smallpox which killed and scarred and blinded, typhus, the gale fever, breeding in crowded, filthy conditions, dysentery and the bloody flux, carried by the contaminated water, tuberculosis, the slow consumption that wasted people away over months and years, measles, influenza, agues and fevers of every kind, infections of wounds that today would be trivial, all of them potentially fatal, all of them untreatable in any real sense. The result was a world saturated with death, and with the constant nearness of death. Life expectancy at birth was low, dragged down savagely by the number of children who died young. People who survived childhood might live to a decent age, but the journey there was a gauntlet, and no one, at any age, could feel truly safe. Death was not a distant abstraction to be tidied away. It was a neighbour, a regular visitor, a presence at every stage of life, and the Tudor mind was shaped, profoundly, by living always within its shadow. So as you go about your afternoon, remember that the greatest danger you face is invisible, in the air you breathe, the water near your food, the flea in your clothes, the cough of the man beside you at the market. You cannot see it, you cannot understand it, you can only hope and pray and carry your little nosegay of herbs and trust to luck. And if luck fails, there is always the doctor, which, I'm sorry to say, is somehow worse. So let us say you fall ill. It happens to everyone, sooner or later, and on a Tudor day the odds are never in your favour. What happens next? Who do you turn to? And why exactly might the treatment be more frightening than the illness itself? At the top of the medical tree sat the physicians, university-educated, expensive, and almost entirely beyond the reach of ordinary people. A physician would diagnose your illness largely through the theory of the four humours, the belief that the body contained four fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health was a matter of keeping them in balance. Illness meant an imbalance, too much of one humour, and the cure was to remove the excess. A physician might also gaze thoughtfully at a flask of your urine, examining its colour, smell, and even taste. Yes, taste, to divine the state of your insides. This was the cutting edge of elite medicine, and it was, to put it kindly, not very effective. Beneath the physicians came the surgeons, and below them the barber-surgeons, who, as the name suggests, would cut your hair and beard and also, with the same hands and often the same premises, perform surgery, pull teeth, lance boils and let blood. The red and white barber's pole, still seen today, is said to descend from this bloody trade, the red for blood, the white for the bandages. Surgery in an age before anaesthetic and before any understanding of infection was a desperate, agonizing, and frequently fatal business, undertaken only when the alternative was certain death, and sometimes not even surviving that bar. And the great cure-all, the treatment reached for again and again across every level of society, was bloodletting. Since so many illnesses were blamed on an excess of blood, the obvious remedy was to remove some by opening a vein or by applying leeches, which obligingly sucked it out. People were bled for fevers, for headaches, for almost anything, and the practice, which weakened already sick patients and did precisely nothing to address most actual illnesses, persisted for centuries out of sheer theoretical conviction. You were, in many cases, more likely to be harmed by the cure than helped. For most ordinary people, of course, the physician was a fantasy, and even the barber-surgeon a luxury. The real medicine of the people was the wise woman, the local healer with her knowledge of herbs and remedies passed down through generations, her poultices and tonics and charms. Some of this folk medicine was genuinely useful. Plants with real medicinal properties accumulated practical wisdom. Some of it was harmless nonsense, and some of it was dangerous in its own right. But it was what most people had, alongside prayer, which was reached for as readily as any herb, because illness was understood as much in spiritual terms as physical ones. So, if you fall ill on your Tudor day, here is your grim menu of options. Pray. Dose yourself with the wise woman's herbs. If you can afford it, be bled, weakened, and possibly poisoned by your betters. And mostly, simply endure, and survive or don't, according to the strength of your body and the whim of fate. The Tudor world could not cure you. It could only watch and hope and bury you if hoping failed. You are, let us assume, still well. The afternoon wears on, and the afternoon, as it happens, often came with entertainment, Tudor entertainment, which, I should warn you, tells you almost everything you need to know about these people. Let us talk about how Tudor people relaxed, how they had fun, what they did for amusement when the work was done, because nothing reveals the soul of an age quite like its idea of a good time. And the Tudor idea of a good time was, by modern standards, genuinely alarming. A great deal of Tudor entertainment involved animals, and a great deal of that involved animals suffering, loudly, in front of a cheering crowd. Bear-baiting was wildly popular, a spectacle in which a bear, chained to a post, was set upon by dogs while spectators watched, wagered, and roared their approval. The bears were valuable, and were often kept alive to fight again, which is the closest thing to mercy in the whole grim business. There was bull-baiting, the same principle with a bull, and there was cockfighting, in which roosters fitted with sharp spurs tore each other apart for the entertainment of an enthusiastic and gambling audience. These were not fringe activities enjoyed by the depraved few. They were mainstream, respectable, attended by all classes, including monarchs. Elizabeth I herself was fond of bear-baiting. If watching animals suffer was not to your taste, there was always watching people suffer, which the Tudor world also provided in generous quantities, free of charge. A public execution was a major event, a holiday atmosphere, drawing enormous crowds who came to watch, to picnic, to buy snacks from vendors, and to enjoy the show. We will dwell on the executions themselves shortly, but it is worth sitting for a moment with the simple fact that for Tudor people, watching a fellow human being put to death was a popular day out, a form of mass entertainment, and nobody thought this strange. But it was not all cruelty, in fairness. There was much that we would recognize, and even enjoy. There was music, which the Tudors loved, from the refined consort music of the wealthy to the ballads and folk songs of the people, sung in homes and alehouses across the land. There was dancing, energetic and communal, at festivals and fairs and celebrations. There were the great seasonal festivities, May Day with its maypole, the long indulgence of the 12 days of Christmas, harvest celebrations, the church ales and feast days that punctuated the hard year with bursts of food, drink, and licensed misbehaviour. There were games, too. Football, in a wild, rule-free, frequently violent form that bore little resemblance to the modern game and was periodically banned for the chaos and injury it caused. There was bowling and tennis for the wealthy, and dice and cards and endless gambling on anything that could be gambled on. There were travelling players and, by the later Tudor period, the great flowering of the theatre, the playhouses where Shakespeare and his rivals would draw crowds of every rank to stand or sit and lose themselves in a story. So the Tudor world was not joyless. Far from it. It worked hard, and it played hard, and it crammed its rare leisure with music and dancing and feasting and laughter. It is only that its appetite for spectacle had a streak of casual brutality running right through it, a comfort with suffering as amusement, that marks it as a genuinely different world from our own. They could dance a merry round, and then stroll over to watch a man hang, and feel no contradiction at all, which brings us, as it brought them, to the scaffold. Before we reach the truly fatal end of Tudor justice, let us spend a little time in its more everyday department, the vast and inventive world of public humiliation, because for most minor offences, the Tudor answer was not a fine or a prison cell, but shame, applied publicly, physically, and with relish. The great instruments of this were the stocks and the pillory, which you have already glimpsed in the marketplace. The stocks were a wooden frame that clamped the ankles, sometimes the wrists too, holding the offender seated and helpless in a public place, usually for a set number of hours. The pillory was the standing version, a frame that clamped the head and hands, leaving the victim bent and exposed before the world. In both cases, the punishment was not really the discomfort of being held, though that was real enough over long hours. The punishment was the exposure. You were placed in the busiest, most public spot in the town, and there you stayed while everyone you knew, and everyone you didn't, walked past and saw you. And they did not just look. The crowd was an active participant. A person in the stocks or pillory was fair game for mockery, abuse, and, very often, missiles. Rotten fruit and vegetables were the traditional ammunition. But crowds were not always so gentle. Mud, filth, stones, dead animals, whatever came to hand might be hurled, and a pilloried person who had genuinely angered the community could be seriously injured or even killed by the mob. The state provided the frame. The people provided the punishment. For certain offences, there were specialised tools. The scold's bridle, also called the branks, was a hideous iron cage fitted over the head of a woman judged to be a nag or a gossip or too sharp of tongue, with a metal plate or spike that pressed down on the tongue to prevent speech, and in this she might be led through the streets as a public lesson. The ducking stool and cucking stool, as we've mentioned, dunked offenders in water before a delighted crowd. Branding marked criminals permanently. A letter burned into the flesh. A T for thief. An F for a brawler who'd caused an affray, so that the offender carried their crime visibly forever. The logic of all this was the logic of a small, tightly bound society, in which reputation was everything, and in which there was nowhere to hide. To be shamed publicly was a genuine catastrophe, because you had to go on living among the very people who had watched you humiliated, and the memory did not fade. Shame was a weapon precisely because community was inescapable. You could not move to a new town and start fresh. You were known, and now you were known as the person in the pillory. So as you pass through the square on your Tudor afternoon, you avert your eyes, or perhaps you don't. Perhaps you join the crowd. Perhaps you toss a handful of muck like everyone else, because that is what is done. And the person in the frame today is a cheat or a brawler, or simply someone who annoyed the wrong official. And you make a quiet note, as every Tudor person did, to never, ever end up there yourself. Because the stocks were the mild end of the law, the other end did not let you go after a few hours. Now we come to it, the dark heart of Tudor justice, the gallows, and the genuinely staggering ease with which a Tudor person could be sentenced to death. Because if there is one thing that separates that world from ours most starkly, it is how little a life was worth in the eyes of the law, and how many things could cost you yours. The Tudor legal code was brutal, and it grew more so. The number of crimes punishable by death was large and expanding, and it included offences that strike the modern mind as absurdly minor. Theft, above a certain modest value, was a hanging offence. Stealing goods worth more than a shilling could, in principle, send you to the gallows. Picking a pocket, stealing a sheep, burglary, robbery on the highway, all could end with a rope. The principle was deterrence through terror, the belief that only the fear of death could keep the desperate and the poor in line. And so the law reached for death readily, for crimes against property as much as crimes against people. The methods varied with the crime and the status of the condemned. Common criminals were hanged, and Tudor hanging was not the quick drop of later centuries, but slow strangulation. The condemned hauled up to choke, sometimes for agonizing minutes, while the crowd watched. Traitors faced worse, the horrific ritual of being hanged, drawn and quartered, a deliberately prolonged and agonizing death designed to punish and to warn. The nobility, by a strange courtesy, were beheaded, a swifter end if the axeman was skilled, and a butchery if he was not. Burning was reserved for heretics and for certain other offences, a death by fire before a watching crowd. And it was all public, all spectacle, as we've said. Executions drew vast crowds. The condemned were expected to play their part, to make a good end, to speak final words of repentance from the scaffold, and a brave or pious death was admired, while a cowardly one was jeered. The bodies of executed criminals were sometimes left to rot in chains at crossroads and town entrances, a grisly warning to all who passed, the skull grinning down from the gibbet for months or years. There were a few mercies, a few cracks in the machinery. There was benefit of clergy, an ancient loophole by which a person who could read a particular passage of scripture, the so-called neck verse, might escape the gallows for a first offence, a privilege that had originally protected actual clergymen but had expanded to cover the literate more generally, a strange reward for literacy in a desperate world. Juries sometimes deliberately undervalued stolen goods to bring them below the hanging threshold, a quiet act of mercy called pious perjury, and not every sentence was carried out. But the gallows were always there, always busy, always hungry. So the great lesson of the Tudor day, the lesson that hung over the poor especially, was this: your life was cheap. The law would take it for a theft born of hunger as readily as for a murder. There was no safety net, no benefit of the doubt for the desperate, only the rope and the watching crowd. And you, walking carefully through your Tudor afternoon, keeping your hands to yourself and your head down, understood this in your bones. You did not steal, however hungry you were, because the price of a loaf, if you took it, might be your neck. It is a heavy thought. Let us turn, by way of relief, to something smaller and stranger and almost funny, which is the state of your teeth. Let us talk about teeth, because here is a small, strange and weirdly cheerful corner of Tudor misery, the slow and increasingly catastrophic decline of the Tudor mouth, brought to you, in large part, by the arrival of a brand new and irresistible substance: sugar. For most of human history, sweetness was rare and precious. found in honey and fruit and little else. But the Tudor period saw the beginning of sugar's great invasion of the English diet, as trade brought it in growing quantities, and the wealthy, who could afford it, fell upon it with helpless enthusiasm. Sugar was a luxury, a status symbol, a marvel, and the rich consumed it in astonishing amounts, in sweets, in sugared wine, in elaborate confections, in subtleties, the spectacular sculpted sugar showpieces that crowned grand feasts. They even, in some cases, used it as a medicine, prescribing sugar for ailments, which is a little like prescribing cigarettes for a cough, and their teeth paid the price. The Tudor wealthy, gorging on sugar that their bodies and their dentistry were utterly unprepared for, developed rotten, blackened, decaying teeth on a heroic scale. The most famous example is Queen Elizabeth I herself, whose love of sweets left her, in later life, with teeth so black and so decayed that foreign ambassadors remarked upon it, and whose dental agonies were the stuff of court legend. Black teeth became, briefly and bizarrely, almost a marker of status, a sign that you were rich enough to afford the sugar that was rotting your head, and some who lacked the means reportedly blackened their teeth deliberately to imitate the look. The poor, who could not afford much sugar, often kept their teeth rather better, an accidental gift of poverty. And what did you do about a rotten, agonizing tooth? You suffered, mostly, and when you could suffer no more, you went to the tooth drawer, and may God have mercy on you. Dentistry, such as it was, meant extraction, the violent pulling of the offending tooth, performed without anaesthetic by a barber-surgeon or a travelling tooth drawer, often in public at fairs and markets, sometimes with music playing loudly nearby, to drown out the screams and draw a crowd. The tooth was wrenched out with pelicans and keys, fearsome iron instruments, in a procedure that was agonizing, dangerous, and frequently left fragments and infection behind. Toothache could and did kill when the infection spread, and a bad tooth was no small thing in a world that could not safely treat it. There were remedies, of the usual hopeful and useless kind. Toothache was sometimes blamed on tooth worms, tiny creatures believed to burrow into the teeth and cause the pain, and various treatments aimed to drive them out. There were herbal washes, charms, prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothache, and a thriving trade in remedies that did nothing at all. People cleaned their teeth, after a fashion, rubbing them with cloths, with powders of dubious composition, with twigs, but the relentless logic of decay, especially among the sugar-loving rich, ground on regardless. So spare a thought, on your Tudor day, for the simple modern miracle of the dentist, the anaesthetic, the toothbrush, the filling. The Tudor mouth was, for many, a slow-burning crisis, a source of chronic low pain and occasional acute agony, and the only real treatment was a strong man, a fearsome iron tool, and a great deal of screaming. Your teeth, you realize, are one more thing this century is quietly ruining. Speaking of bodies under strain, we should talk about how Tudor people came into the world in the first place, because being born was perhaps the single most dangerous thing any of them ever did. Let us go back to the very beginning, to birth itself, because in Tudor Britain the act of being born and the act of giving birth were among the most dangerous things a human being could do, and the shadow of that danger fell across every family in the land. Start with the mothers. Childbirth in the Tudor world was a perilous ordeal, undertaken without any of the medical understanding that makes it relatively safe today. There was no understanding of infection, no effective intervention when things went wrong, no pain relief beyond herbs and endurance, no surgery that the mother was likely to survive. Birth was women's business, attended by a midwife and female relatives and neighbours. In a darkened, closed room, the labouring woman supported by the accumulated wisdom and superstition of generations. When a birth went smoothly, all was well. When it did not, when the baby was badly positioned, when the labour stalled, when bleeding or fever set in, there was very often nothing to be done but watch and pray and lose her. Death in childbirth was common enough that a pregnant woman might quite reasonably set her affairs in order beforehand, might take communion and make her peace, because she genuinely did not know if she would survive the coming weeks. The church had a special service, the churching of women, to welcome a mother back to the community after a successful birth, a ritual of thanksgiving and purification that acknowledged in its way that she had passed through the valley of the shadow and come out alive. Many did not. And then the babies. Infant mortality in Tudor Britain was staggering, heartbreaking, a fact so constant that it shaped the entire emotional landscape of family life. A huge proportion of children died in their first year, and many more before they reached the age of 5, carried off by disease, by infection, by the sheer fragility of a small body in a world without medicine. Parents could expect, quite normally, to bury several of their children. Families had many babies in part because they knew, with grim realism, that many would not survive. The infants who did live faced their own ordeals. Newborns were tightly swaddled, wrapped in bands of cloth that bound their limbs straight, in the belief that this would help them grow correctly, leaving them immobile bundles for much of their early months. They were often wet-nursed among those who could afford it, handed to another woman to breastfeed. They were baptized quickly, urgently, often within days of birth, because an unbaptized baby who died was believed to be denied heaven, and with death so close at hand, no time could be wasted in securing the infant's soul. It would be easy to imagine, from all this, that Tudor parents loved their children less, guarded their hearts against the likelihood of loss. The evidence suggests otherwise. They grieved, deeply, as parents always have. The letters and diaries that survive are full of love and full of sorrow, of mothers and fathers shattered by the deaths of children they had cherished. They simply grieved more often, and against a backdrop of expectation that made the loss no less painful but somehow more bearable, woven as it was into the fabric of every life. So you, living your Tudor day, are a survivor already, one of the lucky ones who made it past the deadly gauntlet of infancy and childhood. Everyone around you is a survivor too, and everyone around you has buried someone small. It is the quiet grief beneath the whole society, the price of admission to a Tudor life, paid by every family again and again. The afternoon light is fading now. Let us turn towards evening, and towards the one reliable comfort the Tudor day had to offer. Since we have been to birth and death, let us visit the great middle event that joined them, marriage, because the Tudor approach to love and matrimony was a curious blend of the deeply practical and the surprisingly tender, and it shaped the household you live in. First, the practicalities, because Tudor marriage was, above all, a practical institution. For the wealthy and the propertied, marriage was a matter of alliance, of land, of money, of family advantage, negotiated between parents like the treaty it essentially was, with the feelings of the young people involved a secondary consideration at best. A good marriage joined estates, sealed bargains, advanced dynasties. Love, if it came, was a happy bonus, expected to grow after the wedding rather than precede it. The higher up the social ladder you climbed, the more your marriage belonged to your family, and the less it belonged to you. But for ordinary people, you and your neighbours, things were a little freer. Commoners had more say in their own matches, more room to marry for affection, or at least for liking, because there was less property at stake to be fought over. Ordinary people also tended to marry later than you might expect, often in their mid-20s. Once a couple had the means to set up a household of their own, which required savings, a trade, a place to live. The image of the child bride belongs mostly to the nobility and royalty, for whom such things were strategic. For the common people, marriage usually waited until adulthood and independence. The marriage itself was a serious business, and a surprisingly informal one in its origins. A binding marriage could be created simply by a couple exchanging vows of consent, the famous hand-fasting, before witnesses, even without a priest, though the Church worked hard over the period to bring marriage firmly under its own roof and ritual. Bans were read, the intention to marry announced publicly on 3 occasions so that any objection could be raised, and the wedding took place at the church door before moving inside. It was a community event, followed by feasting and celebration as lavish as the families could manage. And once married, the household became the basic unit of Tudor society, the little kingdom in which the husband was, in law and in theory, the absolute head. A wife's legal identity was largely absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property independently in most circumstances. Her role was to manage the home, bear and raise the children, and obey, and the law and the church alike were unambiguous about the hierarchy. In practice, of course, real marriages were as varied as real people, full of genuine partnership, affection, negotiation, and the quiet power that wives held in running the household economy. But the official framework was one of male authority and female subordination, taken as the natural and divinely ordained order of things. So the household you woke up in this morning, the shared bed, the family around the fire, the pottage in the pot, is the product of this institution, practical and binding, and occasionally even loving. It is your refuge in a hostile world, the small warm unit against the cold and the danger. And as evening comes on, it is to this household and this fire that you will return. But not quite yet. There is still the rest of the working afternoon to survive, and the afternoon, like every other part of this day, has its ways of hurting you. We have talked about the great killers, the plague and the gallows and the perils of birth. But let us spend a moment on the small ones, the everyday accidents and hazards that filled a Tudor life, because you did not need a great catastrophe to die in Tudor Britain. The ordinary world was quite dangerous enough on its own. Consider fire, the constant, lurking terror of the age. You live in a town of timber buildings, packed close together, heated by open hearths, lit by candles and rushlights and open flames, full of straw and wood and cloth and other things that burn beautifully. Fire was an ever-present danger, and when it took hold it could be catastrophic, leaping from building to building, devouring whole streets and sometimes whole towns before it could be stopped. And it could not easily be stopped, because there were no fire brigades, no hoses, no water on tap, only buckets and hooks and desperate neighbours and prayer. A knocked-over candle, a spark from the hearth, a moment's carelessness, and your home and your life could go up in flames. Consider water, in the other direction. Many people could not swim, and the rivers and ponds and the sea took a steady toll, drownings being one of the most common accidental deaths recorded. Children fell into wells and streams, and the very ditches that ran with sewage. Adults drowned crossing rivers, falling from boats, working near water. Consider the work itself, which we have touched on, the falls from heights, the crushing loads, the kicks from horses and oxen, the cuts and the breaks that turned septic, the slow poisonings of certain trades. Consider the roads, such as they were, muddy and rutted and prowled by robbers. Consider the animals, the half-wild pigs, the working beasts, the very real danger of a frightened horse or an angry bull. Consider the food, spoiled and contaminated in an age without refrigeration, the bad batch of ale, the diseased meat, the fungus on the rye that could send a whole village into convulsions and madness. Consider, even, the festivities, because Tudor celebrations involved a great deal of drink, and drink involves a great deal of poor decision-making, and the coroner's records of the age are full of people who drowned, fell, froze, or fought their way to death while merry. The very pleasures of the age carried their own body count. The point of all this is not to be grim for its own sake, but to capture something true about the texture of a Tudor life, which is that it was lived perpetually close to the edge of accident. There was no safety engineered into the world, no guardrails, no warnings, no regulations, no swift rescue when things went wrong. You navigated a landscape of open flames and deep water, and heavy loads and frightened animals and contaminated food entirely on your own wits and luck. And the smallest misstep, the briefest carelessness, could be your last. People were careful, because they had to be, because the world did not forgive carelessness. And still, constantly, the small disasters came. So you finish your afternoon's work intact, no small achievement, with all your fingers and both your eyes and your home unburned, and you feel the particular tired satisfaction of a Tudor person who has not, today, been killed by anything ordinary. The light is going gold and low, the work is ending, and there is, at the end of the long hard day, one place that promises warmth, company, and the soft forgetting of ale, the alehouse. As the working day winds down, you make your way, as Tudor people across the land made their way, to the alehouse, and here, at last, in the warm, smoky, noisy heart of the community, the Tudor day offers something close to pure comfort. The alehouse was everywhere. It was the pub before the pub, an institution woven into the very fabric of English life, ranging from a humble cottage where a good wife brewed and sold ale from her front room, to larger, established drinking houses, and the grander inns that put up travellers. There were a great many of them, far more per person than today, and they were the social centre of the community, the place where ordinary people gathered, after the church, which was the other one. If the church was where you faced God and the state, the alehouse was where you faced your neighbours, and most people preferred the alehouse. Here you drank, of course, the ale and beer that was the lifeblood of the day, now in its stronger evening incarnation, the good stuff that actually got you drunk, as opposed to the weak, small beer of breakfast. Here you ate, simple food to go with the drink. Here you warmed yourself at a fire that someone else was paying to keep lit. And here, above all, you talked and listened and belonged. The alehouse was where news arrived and was chewed over, where gossip flew, where deals were struck and disputes settled and friendships made and quarrels begun. It was the internet, the news, the social club, and the town square of its day, all served with a foaming jug. There were games, too, dice and cards and bowls and the rest. And there was music and singing, the ballads of the day bellowed out by drinkers who knew all the words. The old songs passed around, the new ones brought by travellers. There was laughter, real laughter, the release of people who worked desperately hard at desperately hard lives, and who seized the evening's warmth and fellowship with both hands. But, this being Tudor Britain, even the alehouse had its shadows and its dangers. The authorities viewed alehouses with deep suspicion as dens of idleness, drunkenness, sedition, and disorder, places where the lower orders might drink too much, talk too freely, gamble away their money, and hatch who knew what mischief. Alehouses were regulated, licensed, watched, periodically cracked down upon, their keepers held responsible for the behaviour of their patrons and the honesty of their measures. Too much loose talk in the alehouse, especially about religion or the king, could find its way to the wrong ears, for the alehouse was also where informers listened, and drink, then as now, loosened tempers as well as tongues. The combination of strong ale, hard men, gambling, and old grudges meant that the alehouse was a frequent setting for brawls, for the sudden violence that could turn a pleasant evening bloody, and a drunken fight that ended in a death could put the survivor on the road to the gallows. The comfort of the alehouse came, like everything else in this world, with a sting in its tail. But for now, for this evening, you sit by the fire with a jug of decent ale and the warm press of familiar faces, and the day's aches ease, and someone strikes up a song, and for a little while the cold and the filth and the danger and the death all recede, and Tudor Britain is, briefly, a good place to be. Hold on to this feeling. It is the high point of your day, because the sun is going down, and the Tudor night is coming, and the Tudor night is a different country altogether. Before we leave the warmth and step into the night, we must understand what the Tudor mind believed was waiting out there, because the Tudor world was not only physically dangerous, it was spiritually and supernaturally dangerous, alive with forces that to them were every bit as real as the plague or the gallows. The Tudor universe was enchanted, in the fullest and most frightening sense. God was real, immediate, and constantly active, rewarding and punishing. And so was the devil, who was not a metaphor or a distant abstraction, but a present and prowling enemy, working through human agents and supernatural means to ensnare souls and cause harm. Between the divine and the diabolical stretched a whole crowded world of spirits, omens, portents, and powers, and the educated and the ignorant alike moved through it with wary belief. Above all, there were witches. The belief in witchcraft was widespread and, over the Tudor period, and especially after, increasingly lethal. A witch was understood to be a person, very often a poor, old, isolated woman, who had made a pact with the devil and used supernatural power to cause harm, to curse, to blight crops, to sicken animals, to kill children, to bring misfortune. When bad things happened, as bad things constantly did, when a cow died, a child sickened, a churning failed, a sudden illness struck, people looked for a cause, and a convenient cause was often the strange old woman down the lane who had muttered something after a quarrel. Witchcraft became a crime, prosecuted in the courts, and accusations could and did send people, overwhelmingly women, to the gallows. It is worth pausing on how this worked, because it reveals the machinery of the Tudor mind under pressure. In a world without scientific explanation, where misfortune struck constantly and randomly and cruelly, witchcraft offered an answer, and worse, a target. The death of a child was unbearable and inexplicable, but if it could be blamed on a witch's malice, then there was a reason, and there was someone to punish, and the unbearable became, in a terrible way, manageable. The witch hunt was, among other things, a way of making sense of a senseless world, and the price was paid by the vulnerable and the friendless. Beyond witches, the supernatural saturated everyday life. Omens and signs were read everywhere, comets and eclipses foretelling disaster, the behavior of animals carrying meaning, dreams bearing messages. Charms and spells and folk magic were used constantly to protect the home, to ensure a good harvest, to win love, to ward off the evil eye. A vast informal magic, running alongside and tangled up with official religion. Ghosts walked. Fairies, not the gentle creatures of later imagination, but dangerous, capricious beings, were genuinely feared. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thin and porous, and at night especially, it seemed to thin almost to nothing. So when you step out of the warm, bright alehouse into the dark, you carry with you a head full of these beliefs, absorbed since infancy, as real to you as the cobbles underfoot. The darkness is not empty, it is crowded with the devil and his works, with spirits and portents and prowling evil, with the witch's curse and the fairy's malice and the restless dead. The Tudor night was frightening not only because it was physically dangerous, though it was, but because the Tudor imagination filled it with terrors. And into that night you must now go, because it is time to go home. You leave the alehouse and step into the gathering dusk. and you make your way home for supper, the last meal of the day, a smaller and quieter affair than the great midday dinner, eaten as the light fails and the household gathers in. Supper was light, by design and by necessity. The big meal had been at midday, when the body needed fuel for work and the light was good for cooking and eating. The evening meal was a modest thing, bread and cheese, the remains of the pottage, perhaps some cold meat if you were fortunate, a little ale, eaten in the deepening gloom by the light of the fire, and, if you could spare it, a candle or a rushlight. It was a meal eaten in the knowledge that the day's work was done, and that nothing now remained but the long dark hours of the night. And here we must dwell on the light, or rather the lack of it, because the failing of the light at the end of the day was one of the great defining facts of Tudor existence, a thing so total and so unlike our own experience that it is genuinely hard to imagine. When the sun went down, real darkness came, the deep, complete darkness of a world without electricity, without streetlights, without the glow of 1,000 screens, and artificial light was expensive, precious, and feeble. The wealthy could afford candles, the best of them made of beeswax, clean-burning and sweet-smelling, the cheaper ones of tallow, rendered animal fat, which smoked and stank and guttered but gave light. The poor made do with rushlights, rushes soaked in fat that burned briefly and dimly and needed constant tending, or with the light of the fire alone, or with nothing at all. Light was rationed, used carefully, never wasted, and the amount of it in even a well-off Tudor home of an evening was a tiny fraction of what we flood our nights with now. A single candle, a glowing hearth, a small trembling island of orange light in an ocean of dark. And so the rhythm of Tudor life was bound utterly to the sun, in a way ours is not. You rose with the light, and you worked with the light, and when the light failed, the day was effectively over, because there was little you could do in the dark. The long winter nights, 16 hours of darkness or more, were spent largely at rest, by the fire, in the dim, in the close company of the household, telling stories, mending, dozing, waiting for the dawn. Some historians have argued that this shaped sleep itself, that people slept in two phases, a first sleep and a second sleep, with a wakeful period in between, in the deep of the night, a pattern lost to us in our brightly lit age. So you eat your modest supper as the last grey light drains from the windows and the fire becomes the only source of warmth and brightness in the world. The household draws in close around it. The darkness presses against the walls, against the small horn or oiled paper windows, against the door. Outside, the town is going dark, house by house, the orange glimmers winking out one by one as fires bank and candles are snuffed to save them. And out there in the spreading black, the Tudor night is beginning, with all its dangers, real and imagined. It is nearly time for bed. But first, you must lock up against the dark, and the dark, in Tudor Britain, is something you take very seriously indeed. As full darkness falls, the Tudor town does something that the modern world has entirely forgotten how to do. It closes. It shuts itself up, draws in, and surrenders the night to the dark, because the night, in Tudor Britain, did not belong to ordinary, honest people. It belonged to trouble. There was in many towns a curfew, an old institution whose very name comes from the French for cover fire, the ringing of a bell in the evening that signalled the time to bank your hearth, cover your fire, extinguish your lights, and retire indoors for the night. The curfew bell tolled across the rooftops, and law-abiding people heeded it, as to be abroad in the streets after dark, without good reason and without a light, was to invite suspicion at best, and serious trouble at worst. For the night belonged, officially, to the watch. The watch was the closest thing the Tudor town had to a police force, a body of ordinary citizens often unpaid and serving by rotation as a civic duty, who patrolled the streets through the dark hours, carrying lanterns and staves and bills, calling out the hours, checking that doors were secured, and challenging anyone they found wandering. The watchmen of the age have come down to us as figures of some comedy, often elderly, frequently incompetent, immortalized in the bumbling constables of Shakespeare's plays, and there is truth in the caricature. But the watch was a real and necessary institution, the thin and wavering line between the sleeping town and the dangers of the night. And if the watch challenged you in the dark, you had better have a good answer. An honest person out at night was expected to carry a light and to be able to explain themselves. A person skulking in the shadows without a lantern, unable to give a good account of their business, was assumed to be up to no good, a thief, a burglar, a cut-purse, a person of ill intent, and could be detained, questioned, held until morning, and handed over to face the consequences. The night was a time of suspicion, when the ordinary rules of daytime life were suspended, and the simple fact of being out and about became evidence of wrongdoing. This was not mere paranoia. The Tudor night genuinely was the province of crime. The cover of darkness, in a world with no street lighting and only the feeble, scattered patrols of the watch, was the natural ally of the thief and the burglar, and worse. Honest people locked themselves away precisely because the dark hours belonged to those who meant harm, and the town drew its boundaries tight against the night. Every household a small fortress, every door barred, every light extinguished, waiting out the dangerous dark until the safety of the dawn. So you hear the curfew bell, and you heed it, as everyone heeds it, and you make your final preparations for the night. The watch will pace the dark streets with their lanterns, calling the hours, and you will lie behind your barred door and listen to them pass, and take what comfort you can from the knowledge that somebody, however bumbling, is awake out there in the dark. The day is nearly done. You have, remarkably, survived it. But the surviving of the night is a separate matter, and it begins with the careful, almost ritual business of locking up. Before you can sleep, you must secure the house. And in Tudor Britain, this was no casual matter of clicking a latch. The shutting up of the home against the night was a serious, deliberate, nightly ritual, because behind that door lay everything you had and everyone you loved, and the night outside held real and various threats. First, the fire. The hearth, the warm and dangerous heart of the home, had to be made safe for the night. You could not simply let it burn, because an unattended fire was the single greatest threat to your home and your life, the spark that could turn your house and your whole street to ash while you slept. So the fire was banked, the embers raked together and covered, sometimes with a special metal cover called a curfew, the same word again, designed to contain the glowing coals so that they would smoulder safely through the night and could be coaxed back to life in the morning, sparing you the misery of starting fresh. Tending the fire down to safe embers without losing it entirely was a nightly skill, the last and most important chore of the day. Then the securing of the doors and the windows. The door was barred, not merely latched, with a heavy wooden bar dropped across it, or bolted, or locked with whatever lock you possessed, because burglary was a real and constant fear, and a barred door was your first and best defense. The windows, such as they were, small openings closed with wooden shutters or covered with oiled paper, or, for the wealthy, precious glass, were fastened and shuttered against the cold and against intruders. The house was sealed, closed up tight, a wooden box of warmth and family, barred against the dark and the cold and whatever moved in the night. And there was a spiritual dimension to the locking up too, woven through the practical one. Remember the crowded supernatural night we spoke of, the prowling devil, the wandering spirits, the dangers that were not merely physical. The securing of the home had its protective charms and customs as well as its bars and bolts, the prayers said, the blessings invoked, the small folk rituals meant to keep out not just the burglar but the evil spirit, the witch's malice, the things that walked in the dark. You barred the door against the thief and you blessed it against the devil, and to the Tudor mind these were not so very different, both real dangers to be guarded against as the family settled for the night. So the household goes through its nightly closing. The fire is banked down to glowing embers under its cover. The door is barred, the shutters are fastened, the animals, if you keep them close, are secured. The candle or rushlight is brought out for the brief business of getting to bed, to be snuffed the moment it is no longer needed, for light is precious and not to be wasted on sleeping. The little fortress is sealed, and within it, in the dim red glow of the banked fire, the family prepares to face the most ordinary, and yet, in its way, the most extraordinary part of the Tudor day, sleep. But not before we glance, one last time, at how very differently this same night was being spent on the other side of the Great Divide. Let us indulge ourselves, as the cold closes around your little barred cottage, with a brief look at how the other half spent this same Tudor night, because the gulf between your existence and theirs was so vast as to be almost comic, and the contrast tells you everything about the world you have been living in all day. While you bank your single hearth and bar your door against the dark, the great household of a wealthy noble blazes with light and warmth. In the manor house or the grand townhouse, fires roar in multiple hearths. Beeswax candles burn by the dozen, casting a golden glow that you, with your single rushlight, can scarcely imagine. The wealthy did not ration light the way you did. They flooded their evenings with it, because they could, and the simple act of being able to see in the dark was itself a luxury, a marker of a wholly different order of existence. The evening meal in such a household bore no resemblance to your bread and cheese in the gloom. Even an ordinary supper among the great was a substantial affair of meat and wine and white bread, served by servants, eaten in a hall hung with tapestries to keep out the draughts, the table laid with vessels of pewter or silver. And a feast, a real feast, was a spectacle of staggering excess, course after course of roasted meats and birds and fish, sauces rich with expensive spices brought from the other side of the world, sugared confections and subtleties, all of it a deliberate, dazzling display of wealth and power, consumed before an audience of guests and servants who were meant to be impressed, and were. The wealthy slept differently too. They had proper bedchambers, private rooms, a thing you can barely conceive of, and great curtained beds with feather mattresses and fine linen sheets, and heavy hangings drawn against the cold. Beds that cost more than you would earn in years, and that were among a family's most prized possessions, passed down in wills with great ceremony. They had servants to warm the bed with a pan of coals, to tend the fire through the night, to bring them anything they desired. They were clean, by the standards of the age, changed linen often, scented with herbs and spices. They were, in every physical particular, living a different life in a different world that happened to occupy the same dark and dangerous night as your own. And yet, here is the quiet truth that runs underneath the contrast, the thing worth carrying with you into the dark. For all their fires and feathers and feasts, the great were not safe. The plague did not check your rank before it took you. The sweating sickness killed the rich as readily as the poor, sometimes more so, striking down the well-fed and the comfortable in their curtained beds. Childbirth killed noble women as surely as commoners. The executioner's axe, indeed, fell on the necks of the mighty more readily than the humble. For the higher you climbed in that treacherous world, the closer you stood to the king's terrible favour and the king's terrible wrath. Anne Boleyn slept in the finest beds in England, and it did not save her. So while you may envy the warmth and the light and the full table of the great house on this cold night, Take what comfort you can in the grand democracy of Tudor death, which came for all of them in the end, the Duke and the labourer alike, and was not much impressed by either. The night holds the same darkness for everyone, and now, at last, it is time for you to enter it. It is time, finally, for sleep. And so, at last, you return to the bed where this whole long day began, the shared, sagging, softly rustling, thoroughly inhabited bed, and you prepare to surrender yourself to the night. The wheel of the Tudor day has turned full circle, from the cold, dark waking before dawn to the cold, dark settling after dusk, and you have, against considerable odds, survived all the hours in between. Undressing for bed was a simpler matter than dressing had been, though not by much. You stripped off the outer woolen layers, which were laid aside or hung up, and you slept, very often, in your linen shirt or smock, the same garment you had worn all day, which served as both undergarment and nightwear. Night clothes as a separate category were a luxury for the better off. For you, the day shirt became the night shirt, and you climbed into bed in the linen that had been against your skin since morning. A nightcap went on the head, for the room was cold, and much heat is lost from the head, and a capped sleeper was a warm sleeper. The bed itself, as we discussed at dawn, was no haven of hygiene. The straw or flock mattress, the rough sheets if you had them, the woolen blankets and coverlets piled on for warmth, all of it harboured the same teeming population of fleas and lice and bedbugs that had been your companions at waking, now refreshed and ready for the night shift. You would be bitten. You expected to be bitten. The faint, constant, low-grade itch was simply part of going to bed, as normal and unremarkable as the cold or the dark. And you were not alone. The bed was shared, the bodies pressed close, partly from lack of space and partly, sensibly, for warmth, for a huddle of sleepers generated and held heat far better than one shivering soul alone. Family members slept together, parents and young children, siblings side by side. The whole household sometimes gathered into one or two beds in one or two rooms, breathing the same air, sharing the same warmth, the same blankets, the same small biting wildlife. Privacy was not merely scarce. For most people it did not meaningfully exist, and the idea of a person, especially a child, sleeping alone in a room of their own would have seemed strange, wasteful, and rather sad. There was a comfort in this closeness, for all its lack of privacy and its abundance of fleas. To sleep pressed warm against your family, in the dark, behind the barred door, with the banked fire glowing low, was to be as safe and as held as the Tudor world allowed anyone to be. The dangers of the day were shut outside. The dangers of the night, real and imagined, were kept at bay by the bar on the door, and the bodies all around, and the prayers said before sleeping. For a few hours, in the warm breathing dark, you could let go. So you settle into the pile of warm bodies and rough blankets, in your day-worn linen and your nightcap, the fleas already getting to work, the fire a dull red glow across the room, the others breathing slow around you. Your aching, labouring body sinks gratefully into the lumpy mattress, and as your eyes close you are not quite finished with the day, because the Tudor night had a particular shape to it, a rhythm that we have entirely lost, and it is one of the strangest and most fascinating things about how these people lived. They did not, it seems, sleep the way we sleep at all. Here is one of the strangest and most wonderful things about the Tudor night, a thing so different from how we live now that it feels almost like science fiction in reverse. You did not sleep in one long unbroken stretch the way you do, or the way you wish you did, lying there in the modern dark, willing yourself under. You slept in two. The Tudor night, and indeed the night for most people in most of history before bright, cheap, artificial light came along and ruined everything, was divided into two sleeps. There was the first sleep, which came on soon after dark, when the body, exhausted by a day of relentless physical labor, simply shut down. You went under hard and early, sometimes only a few hours after sunset, because what else was there to do in a house with no light? And because dawn and its demands would come around again with brutal punctuality. And then, somewhere in the deep middle of the night, perhaps around midnight, perhaps a little after, you woke. Not with alarm, not with the modern 3 a.m. panic of a mind that has remembered every mistake you have ever made. You simply surfaced, naturally, gently, into a strange and quiet interval that had its own name. They called it the watch, or the watching, and it was a recognized and ordinary part of the night, a little island of wakefulness floating between the first sleep and the second. And during this watch, people did things, quiet things, things suited to the warm dark. They lay and talked softly with whoever shared the bed, the murmured low conversations of people with no privacy at any other hour. They thought, they prayed. For this middle night waking was considered a fine and holy time to speak to God. The house silent, the soul undistracted. Some got up to tend the fire, or check on the animals, or relieve themselves, and a few enterprising souls apparently used the interval to slip out and visit a neighbour, which raises questions we shall politely leave alone. It was also, let us be delicate, a time when married couples found themselves awake, warm, undisturbed, and with nothing in particular demanding their attention. The physicians of the age, who had an opinion on everything, rather approved, holding that the first sleep had given the body time to rest, and was therefore an excellent moment for the begetting of children. We will say no more, except to note that a surprising amount of Tudor England was, in a sense, conceived in the gap between two sleeps. And then, the watch over, you lay back down, and the second sleep took you, deeper and dreamier than the first, carrying you down through the small hours toward the cold, grey arrival of dawn. 2 sleeps, with an island of gentle waking between them, the whole night shaped like a thing with a soft hinge in the middle. You, lying there now in your single modern stretch of sleep that you guard so anxiously, might find this idea strangely consoling, because if you have ever woken in the deep of the night and lain there fretting that something is wrong with you, that you are broken, that you have failed at the simple animal task of sleeping, then here is a thought to soften the dark. For most of human history, waking in the night was not a malfunction. It was the design. Your Tudor ancestor, surfacing into the watch, would have thought nothing of it at all. They would simply have murmured a prayer, or a word to the warm body beside them, and waited, unbothered, for the second sleep to come. So that first sleep is settling over you now, in your Tudor bed, the fire a low red eye across the room, the household breathing slow around you. In a few hours you will surface into the watch, into the quiet, holy middle of the night. But not yet. For now, you simply sink. Lying there in the watch, in the gap between your 2 sleeps, you might wonder what time it is. And here we run into another of those small, profound differences between your world and the Tudor one. Because the honest answer is that you would not really know, and more to the point, you would not really care. You live drowned in time. There is a clock on your wall, a clock on your wrist, a clock glowing on the very screen you should have stopped looking at, all of them agreeing to the second, all of them quietly insisting that the moment is precisely this and not that. You know the time always, exactly, whether you want to or not. Your Tudor self knew the time almost never, and approximately, and got along perfectly well. A commoner did not own a clock. Mechanical clocks existed, great iron things in church towers and the halls of the wealthy, and a rich man might carry a watch the size of a small turnip, purely to show that he could. But for you, the ordinary person, time was not a number. Time was a feeling, a position of the light, a sound carried on the air. By day you read the sun, its height and its lean, and if the sky was a flat grey lid, as English skies so often are, you simply made your best guess and got on with it. But at night, in the true dark, even the sun was no help, and so you listened. The great timekeeper of the Tudor world was the church bell. It rang for the services of the day, it rang to summon and to warn, and its voice, rolling out across the rooftops and the fields, told everyone within earshot roughly where they stood in the turning of the hours. In some towns the watchman walked his round through the night, calling out the time and a word of reassurance that all was well, his voice floating up to the half-waking listeners in their beds like a spoken, plodding clock. To lie in the dark and hear the watch cry the hour was to be told, by a living human throat, that the night was proceeding in good order and you might safely sink back down. And there was the cock, that feathered tyrant, who crowed not only at dawn but in rough stages through the latter part of the night, so that people spoke of the first cock and the second cock as markers of time, as natural and as trusted as any bell. The rooster was an alarm clock you could not switch off, snooze or reason with, and it announced the coming morning whether you were ready for it or not, which you never were. Those who could read them used the stars, the slow wheel of the heavens turning overhead, the known constellations climbing and sinking in their appointed order. A clock as old as the world and visible, on a clear night, to anyone who had learned its face. And the moon, when it shone, gave both a little light and a rough sense of the hour by its place in the sky. What all of this meant, taken together, is that the Tudor relationship with time was loose, soft, forgiving, in a way that ours simply is not. Things happened around dawn, or about midday, or toward evening, or at cockcrow, or after the second bell. An appointment was a vague and hopeful arrangement, not a precise coordinate. Nobody was 3 minutes late, because there were no minutes to be late by, not in any way an ordinary person could measure. The whole frantic modern tyranny of the exact moment, the meeting that starts at 10 on the dot, the train that leaves at 17 minutes past, simply did not exist, and could not have existed, in a world that told the time by roosters and bells and the lean of the light. There is something restful in that, lying here in your own over-measured night. Your Tudor self did not lie awake calculating, with rising dread, exactly how many hours and minutes of sleep remained, if they dropped off this very instant. That grim modern arithmetic we all know too well. They did not know the number, could not have known it, and so they could not torment themselves with it. They simply slept until the body had had enough, or the bell rang, or the cock crowed, or the grey light came creeping under the shutter, and then they rose and met the day. So do not check the time. Whatever hour it is where you are, let it be vague, let it be soft, let it be Tudor. There is no bell that needs answering, no cock that will summon you, no number you must beat. The hour does not matter. Let it blur. We must talk about the dark, because the Tudor dark was a different creature entirely from the thing you call darkness, and it would have frightened you far more than you can easily imagine. Your darkness, the darkness of your bedroom right now, is not really dark at all. There is the glow of a charger, the seep of a streetlight around the curtain, the pale rectangle of a screen you really ought to have put down by now. True darkness, total and absolute, the darkness of a Tudor night in a house with the fire banked and the shutters closed, and not a single other source of light for miles, is something most modern people have never once experienced. It is a darkness you can feel, a darkness that presses on the eyes, a darkness in which you cannot see your own hand held an inch from your face. And into that darkness, the Tudor mind poured its terrors, because the night was not empty, the night was full. The night belonged to things that the day kept safely hidden. There were ghosts, the restless dead who had not settled properly into their graves, who walked and moaned and had business with the living. There were spirits and fairies, Not the gentle winged creatures of later storybooks, but capricious, dangerous things that might steal a child, sour the milk, or lead a traveller off the path to his death. There were witches, abroad in the dark, working their malice. And over all of it, the great shadow behind every Tudor fear, there was the devil himself, prowling, watchful, endlessly patient, looking for a soul left carelessly unguarded. The dark hours were his hours. This is why the prayers said before sleep were so heartfelt, so necessary. You did not pray at bedtime merely out of habit. You prayed because you were about to spend long hours blind and helpless in the territory of the enemy, and the prayer was a wall, a warding, a plea to be kept safe until the blessed return of the light. To die in your sleep, unshriven, with your soul unprepared, was a genuine terror, and the night was when such things happened. Every sound, in that pressing dark, was a question with a frightening answer. The creak of the house settling, the scratch of something in the thatch overhead, which might be a rat, or might be something worse, the cry of an owl, that bird of ill omen, whose call near a house was widely held to foretell a death, the bark of a dog, at nothing, the wind in the eaves that sounded, if you let it, like voices. Lying in the warm dark, you heard all of it, and your mind, well stocked with demons and the walking dead, supplied the rest. This is part of why the barred door and the shared bed mattered so much, why we made such a point of them. They were not just protection against thieves and the cold. They were protection against the night itself, against everything the dark contained. To be sealed in, surrounded by sleeping family, the holy words said, the fire's last embers glowing like a tiny faithful guardian, was to be as defended as you could be against a darkness that was, to the Tudor mind, genuinely and literally full of evil. You, of course, know better. You know the owl is just an owl, the scratch in the roof just a mouse, the wind just the wind. You have the enormous, underrated luxury of a darkness that is empty, a night that contains nothing worse than your own wandering thoughts. Hold on to that comfort. Your Tudor self, lying rigid at every creak, would have traded a great deal for a single night as untroubled by demons as the one you are having right now. And then there were the dreams, because to the Tudor mind sleep was not simply rest, sleep was a doorway, and things came through it. A dream, to your Tudor self, was rarely just a dream. It was a message, a sign, a thing freighted with meaning that a wise person would do well to interpret. Some dreams were held to come from God, warnings or comforts sent down to the sleeping soul. Some, more alarmingly, were thought to come from the devil, who could slip falsehoods and temptations into a mind too unguarded to resist. And some were simply omens, the future leaking backward into the night, showing itself in symbols to those who knew how to read them. So people paid attention to their dreams in a way you mostly do not. To dream of certain things was lucky, of others catastrophic. There were dream readers and cunning folk who would, for a small consideration, tell you what your nighttime visions meant. A dream of teeth falling out, then as now, was widely feared to foretell a death in the family, which, given the state of Tudor teeth, must have been a fairly common and deeply unwelcome nightly occurrence. A dream of clear water might mean one thing, muddy water another. The whole sleeping world was a text to be decoded, and the stakes of the decoding felt very high. This gave the night a weight, a significance, that our nights have quite lost. When you lie down to sleep, you do not generally expect to receive a divine warning, or a glimpse of next week, or a whispered lie from the father of lies himself. You expect, at most, an anxiety dream about an examination you finished decades ago. But your Tudor self lay down each night at the edge of the supernatural, half expecting the dark to speak, and quite often convinced, on waking, that it had. There were charms and prayers against bad dreams, against the night terrors that pressed on the chest, the suffocating weight that we now understand as sleep paralysis, but which they understood, far more frighteningly, as a demon or a hag squatting on the sleeper, stealing the breath. To wake unable to move, a crushing presence on your chest, a shape half seen in the corner of the black room, and to believe, with your whole heart, that it was a thing from hell come to take you, is a terror it is genuinely difficult for the modern mind to fully feel. They felt it, regularly, and they had only their prayers to set against it. So the Tudor night was busy, in its way, not with light and noise and screens, but with meaning, with dread, with the constant low hum of the supernatural pressing close against the thin walls of sleep. The day was hard, but the day was at least understood. The night was where the universe grew strange and large and full of things that wished you ill, and where the only real defences were a barred door, a banked fire, a warm crowd of sleeping kin, and the words of a prayer murmured into the dark. You have none of those defences tonight, and you do not need a single one of them. There is nothing in your dark. Let that be the thought that carries you onward, soft and reassuring, as your own night rolls quietly toward its end. And so, against every reasonable expectation, the sky outside begins at last to pale. The black of the window softens to grey. Somewhere a cock crows, that universal Tudor alarm clock, and then another, and the long, perilous, extraordinary night is over. You have survived your single day in Tudor Britain. Let us, gently and with no small amazement, count up just what you survived. You woke before dawn in a bed full of fleas, and you were not eaten alive, which was a promising start. You got dressed without strangling yourself in the laces, navigated a street that was also an open sewer without contracting anything immediately fatal, and ate a breakfast that left you faintly, permanently drunk, which was, frankly, a sensible response to everything else. You did a day's brutal labour without losing a limb to it. You went to church and did not, even once, say the wrong thing about God, which in the reign of Henry VIII was a genuine and ongoing achievement, the wrong opinion being a reliable route to a very bad afternoon. You walked through a market designed to cheat you and were not entirely ruined. You ate dinner without choking on a bone or being poisoned by something kept slightly too long. You breathed air thick enough to stand a spoon in and did not catch the sweating sickness, which could kill you between breakfast and supper, and frequently did. You avoided the barber-surgeon, which is to say you avoided being cured, which was usually worse than the disease. You did not get put in the stocks, did not get hanged for stealing something worth more than a few pennies, did not lose all your teeth in a single afternoon, and were not accused of witchcraft by a neighbour with a grudge and an overactive imagination. You survived the simple, constant, grinding danger of a world with no antibiotics, no anaesthetic, no clean water, no understanding of germs, and no safety net of any kind whatsoever. A world where a scratch could kill you, a cough could empty a street, and a bad harvest could starve a county. You barred your door against the thieves and the spirits. You slept your 2 sleeps with the watch between them. You lay rigid through the terrors of a truly dark dark. And you woke, blinking, aching, flea-bitten, and alive. Most people, on most days, did exactly this. That is the quiet astonishment at the heart of it all. The ordinary Tudor commoner got up and survived this gauntlet not once, as a thrilling adventure, but every single day, for an entire lifetime, however long or short that lifetime turned out to be. They were tougher than us. They had to be. The world gave them no other option. So well done. You lasted your 24 hours, which is considerably better than I promised you would. You may now, with a clear conscience and an enormous sense of relief, hand the whole exhausting business back to the people who actually had to live it, and return to your own soft, warm, gloriously boring, gloriously safe modern night. They have earned their rest, those long ago people, and so, after all that, have you. So let the Tudor world go now, gently, the way you'd set down something old and fragile that you were never really meant to carry. Let the cold house fade, and the biting bed, and the dark street that was also a river of filth. Let the fear go, all of it. The fear of the wrong word and the wrong cough and the wrong dream. The fear of the dark and the things the dark was said to hold. None of it is yours. None of it ever was. You were only visiting, only listening, only borrowing one long imaginary day from people who have been at peace for 500 years and who do not need you to keep their hardships awake any longer. Let them rest, those ordinary Tudor souls, the ones who woke before dawn and laboured till dark and barred the door, and said their prayers and slept their 2 sleeps in the warm and biting dark. They are done now. The work is finished, the long day over, the fire gone cold centuries ago. Wherever they are not cold any more, and they are not afraid, and the night holds nothing against them. Let them sleep. They earned it more thoroughly than we can easily imagine. And you can let go of your own day now too, whatever it held, whatever you carried into this dark with you. It can wait. It will all still be there in the morning. And the morning will come softly and safely, with no cock-crow, no cold floor, no labour that could maim you. None of it. Just the quiet return of the light, and a day that, for all its modern troubles, will not once try to kill you. Feel the weight of the blanket over you, warm and clean and entirely your own. Feel how soft the bed is, how it asks nothing of you, how no one else is in it unless you wish them to be, how there is not a single flea in the whole gentle length of it. Feel the dark around you, and know that it is empty, that it is kind, that it holds nothing at all but rest. Your breathing is slowing now. Let it. Let each breath out run a little longer than the one before. Let your shoulders soften, and your hands uncurl, and the small machinery of your thoughts wind slowly, slowly down. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. There is no door to bar, no fire to bank, no prayer required to keep you safe through the night, because you are already safe, already warm, already exactly where you are meant to be, which is here, sinking softly down into the deep and gentle dark of sleep. Good night, traveller. You lasted the whole long day, and the night is yours, and it is quiet, and it is kind. Rest now. Sleep well. I'll be here when you wake.